They made Marcus Taylor stand at the gate while every other passenger filed through, just because of the color of his skin. Not because his boarding pass was wrong, not because his name was missing from their list. No, it was simply because someone decided that a black man couldn't possibly belong in first class. He felt the weight of every stare as the petite gate agent in her pressed blazer barked at him to wait, her eyes flicking over his tailored gray suit as if he were a mistake she could scrub out. Then she rifled through his bag like she was hunting for something, some perfume or spice that no one else could smell, and announced a different seat was protocol. Marcus didn't flinch. He had flown internationally 3 times just this past quarter for Novatek Systems, the company he'd built from scratch over the last decade. He knew how gates worked, how priority points fell, and how to move through an airport lounge with quiet authority. Still, as he approached gate A19 for flight 247 to Zurich, the polished tile underfoot suddenly felt like a public stage. The neon lights reflected off his sleek roller bag, the one he'd chosen because it fit neatly in overhead bins without drawing attention. Today, of all days, it would draw every kind of attention. The moment he handed his pass to the agent, she wore a curl of sour surprise, then tapped her computer until it glowed green. Instead of a welcome aboard, she turned away to summon her supervisor, a silver-hailed man whose gait screamed entitlement. He unfolded his clipboard like it was a weapon and sneered. "Name?" Marcus held out his boarding pass, offered his ID, and kept his voice steady when he said, "Marcus Taylor, seat 2A confirmed last month." He watched the supervisor ignore the documents. "How did you purchase this ticket?" he asked, voice dripping false concern. "Rewards points? An employee promotion?" The question felt like a slap in a quiet room. "I paid in full," Marcus said, forcing a calm note into his tone. "Corporate fare, Novatek Systems." His words landed flat, but the frost beneath them was anything but. The man's smile sharpened, patronizing, thin. "Well, you know protocol is strict these days. We've had anomalies." From people like me, Marcus thought, but he only said, "Apply it equally then." After another 5 minutes of forced waiting, with every passerby casting glances that said, "You don't belong here," they let him through. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of his dignity. He stepped onto the jet bridge and swallowed the urge to make a scene. As he crossed the threshold into the cabin, another attendant blocked his path. "One moment, please," she said, sniffing toward his leather briefcase like she was auditioning for a perfume ad. "We've detected an odor." Marcus unzipped the case to reveal his MacBook, a stack of contracts, and a leather notebook. She hovered, inhaling again as though searching for a scent she could pin on him. "Maybe I was mistaken," she murmured. Marcus looked her in the eye and said softly, "Or maybe you made a report without cause." She offered a tight smile and pointed toward 2A, as if he'd been inconvenienced rather than insulted. He slid into the seat, the genuine leather cool against his back, but the ember in his chest burned hotter than any seat heater. He knew exactly what they wanted, an outburst, a scene to justify their prejudice. He wouldn't give it to them. Then he noticed the waist bag, translucent and used, resting on the cushion as if placed by a cruel hand. Next to it lay a slip of paper scribbled with "Non-essential staff seat for service use only," written in black marker. It wasn't printed on Airline stationery. It was a personal attack, stamped on his humanity. All around him, the cabin felt like a theater of indifference. No one met his eyes. Flight attendants smiled at the others, but when he caught one's gaze, she looked away. A couple nearby whispered jokes that drifted just loud enough. Jokes about charity upgrades, diversity hires, tech hacks. The message was loud and clear: "You don't belong here." They had orchestrated every slight, every sniff, every chuckle, every scripted apology they chose not to deliver. Then the man in 2C made his move. He settled in with a flourish, his Rolex catching the overhead lights, and leaned over to a flight attendant. "Quick question. How do upgrades work these days? Mileage-based, or are they giving them away?" His voice was low but carried, like a punch delivered through silk. A few passengers snickered. The attendant's eyes widened, and Marcus could feel her discomfort, but he stayed still, his expression calm. Inside, though, his pulse spiked. A different attendant offered champagne to the guy in 2C, then came to Marcus with a tray. She tilted her head as she asked, "Would you prefer something else? Soda? Juice?" Her tone was that of a parent talking to a child who's asked for the moon. He said evenly, "I'll have what he's having, unless there's a problem." Her smile tightened, but she poured. The man in 2C studied him. "No offense, but you look more like a hacker than someone who earns a seat," he said, the words soft but heavy. His smile was smug, a brace of arrogance. Marcus turned and swept back, calm as glass. "And you look like someone who inherited what he didn't build," he replied. The man's grin faltered. By the time the doors closed and the engines roared to life, Marcus had cataloged every slight. The waste bag, the sniff test, the rival's sneer, the silent complicity of a cabin full of strangers. At 35,000 feet, the economics of entitlement had been laid bare. Clean, rehearsed, served with a side of cruelty. But Marcus wasn't paranoid. He was observant. He folded the note, slid it into his notebook, and let his calm mask slip for just a heartbeat. There, in that moment, as the seatbelt sign blinked, a promise formed in his mind. No one would leave this plane believing they'd gotten away with it. He would make sure of it. When this jet touched down in Zurich, they'd discover that Marcus Taylor was more than a silent passenger. He was a force none of them saw coming, and at that moment, every insult, every veiled jab, every ounce of indignity would come due. Interest and principle. Marcus Taylor felt the pressure building like cabin air before it compressed into a storm. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his phone, not to argue or defend, but to record, a simple voice memo to capture every word, every tone. He tapped the record button just as a flight attendant materialized beside him like a shadow creeping across the cabin floor. She said, her voice low and clipped, "We ask that you refrain from recording or using devices during this phase of the flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We're already at cruising altitude," he thought. She hesitated, glancing at the other passengers, then leaned in. "It's protocol for security reasons. Some guests find it disruptive." His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He slid the phone back into his pocket without a word. He knew then that in their eyes he was the problem, not the man 2 seats down piping up about charity upgrades or the cagey glances that followed. All he wanted was documentation, proof, but they'd drawn their lines the moment he stepped aboard. Across the aisle, the man in seat 2C smirked at Marcus's compliance. "See?" he said, raising his glass in mock toast. "Rules are rules." A few passengers laughed or nodded in agreement. Marcus stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, but inside every slight was etched into his memory. He watched the attendant pour another glass of champagne for the man without asking. When she offered an apologetic nod to Marcus as though she felt the tiniest twinge of guilt, her tone was cooler this time. "Would you like something else to drink, sir?" Marcus shook his head. He wasn't interested in the performance of service anymore. He wanted clarity, and clarity was coming, though not until he had mapped every reaction, every slight, every act of complicity. Once dinner service began, Marcus pulled his leather-bound journal from his briefcase and started to scribble, not flight details, but code fragments, data flows, ideas for his next cybersecurity proposal. It wasn't because he needed to work, but because sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is progress. To him, that notebook was sacred, a space where no one could question his presence or motive. But the man in 2C broke the quiet again, his voice just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Still working, huh?" he said, leaning back with a self-satisfied grin. "Grind never stops, right?" Marcus looked up, blinked once, then replied evenly, "Something like that." The man laughed. "Must be nice to do what you love, especially when you didn't earn the seat." Marcus's chest tightened. Every word stung like acid. Then the cockpit door opened and a change swept through the cabin. Conversations tapered off. Passengers sat straighter. Marcus sensed what was coming before the captain spoke his name. The man was tall, with a silver mustache and posture that declared authority. He stopped in front of Marcus's seat and cleared his throat. "Mr. Taylor, I'm going to have to ask you to accompany me to another section of the plane." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem?" The captain's face stayed neutral. "We've received reports of passenger discomfort regarding inappropriate behavior and unauthorized recording devices. As a precaution, we're reallocating your seat." Marcus felt every eye on him, wondering which false charge would stick this time. "So, you're moving me because someone's uncomfortable with my presence?" he asked. The captain didn't answer. He only nodded at two air marshals who emerged from the galley like silent giants. The air marshals stepped forward, their faces stone. One leaned down and said in that rehearsed tone of controlled power, "Sir, refusal may affect your future boarding privileges." The words were both threat and promise. Marcus understood the subtext: refuse and he'd be labeled non-compliant, disruptive, even dangerous. Instead, he stood, dignity intact, and followed them down the aisle. Behind him, the cabin erupted in slow, sarcastic applause. It wasn't celebration. It was confirmation. A performance of entitlement at 35,000 feet. The man in 2C beamed like he'd won a bet, and the attendants returned to their chores as though nothing unusual had happened. They led Marcus past the first-class curtain, past the galley, and down to a jump seat reserved for off-duty crew. It was cold, metal-framed, barely padded. "Temporarily," one marshal said as Marcus sat without protest. No water was offered, no apology or explanation followed. He was invisible, exiled from luxury to a cramped corner with the hum of engines and the faint clink of ice in other passengers' glasses. Invisibility had its own clarity. From this angle he watched whose eyes darted toward him from behind the curtain and listened to snippets of conversation trying to rationalize what they'd done. Injustice was being repackaged as security protocol, as routine discipline. Then came a crack in their narrative. A few rows ahead, a college-aged woman with thick braids and wireless earbuds raised her phone and hit record. She whispered into the camera, "They're moving him for nothing. He hasn't done a thing." Her live stream caught every moment. The captain's clipped command, the marshal's silent menace, the lazy applause that followed. For a few minutes, that clip spread across social feeds like wildfire. Outrage poured in, viewers appalled by the raw display of Prejudice. Marcus felt a flicker of relief, knowing someone was witnessing, broadcasting the truth. But the system responded fast. An operations lead, badge gleaming, crouched beside her seat and leaned in so only she could hear. "We don't allow video on this flight," he whispered. "Delete that footage now." The woman's jaw set. "I know my rights," she said quietly. "This is public space." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is security. Refusal to comply means we'll report you upon landing. You could be banned from future flights." The threat hovered over her like a storm cloud. She hesitated, then ended the stream with a trembling thumb. The man rose, smoothing his uniform as though he'd just performed a kindness. Marcus watched the scene unfold from his jump seat. The woman's shoulders sagged as her phone slipped into her lap. Passengers around her exchanged glances, some offering sympathetic looks she couldn't see. In that moment, Marcus realized they weren't just silencing him, they were silencing every witness who might testify to the truth. Anger mingled with pity in his chest. The cruelty unfolded in layers, the initial indignity, the enforced silence, the smothering of solidarity. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared with a practiced smile and gestured for Marcus to come sit in the back. "Mr. Taylor," she said, "we've arranged a more comfortable seat further back." He followed her to the very last row, across from the lavatory where the scent of disinfectant mixed with jet fuel. The seat was stiff, fixed upright, next to a rattling service cabinet. She left without another word. Marcus settled in, then closed his eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the sting of cold metal against his back. He wasn't angry yet. He was calculating. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus mapped the situation like a security analyst hunting an exploit. He cataloged weak links, decision points, liability trails. He noticed which attendants hesitated before they spoke, which passengers averted their eyes, which crew members exchanged secretive glances. It wasn't indignity that consumed him now. It was infrastructure. How a system rigged itself against one man, and how every person on board played a part. Marcus Taylor didn't just build software. He built frameworks to dismantle corruption and rebuild what was broken. When the plane finally began its descent, Marcus rose from the jump seat and retrieved his journal. He flipped to a clean page and began writing a single line, all data to Zurich. The rest would follow. He would use every recording, every witness account, every ounce of proof to hold them accountable. There would be legal action, public exposure, boardroom fallout. He pictured the headlines as the doors opened and the cabin lights flicked on. First-class discrimination case shakes aviation industry. He could almost feel the tremor, the shift in power as his evidence spread through media channels and regulatory agencies. By the time the wheels touched down on the tarmac at Zurich, Marcus Taylor's dignity had been tested in every possible way. They had tried to erase him, to demote him to an expendable afterthought, to erase the truth with threats and silence. Instead, they had forged a record of every slight, a dossier of prejudice measured in cold protocol and complicity. As he stood to gather his belongings, he straightened his shoulders and exhaled. No one on that flight would leave untouched. Their choices, their cruelty, their cowardice would all come due. Marcus Taylor would ensure they felt the full force of accountability, and the world would watch them fall. Marcus Taylor felt a faint vibration on his wrist just as he reached into the lining of his jacket. He tapped twice on the side of his watch and, without drawing any attention, slipped a tiny wireless earpiece into his right ear. His voice dropped to a whisper that barely moved his lips. "Activate level 3, he said, the words measured and precise as if he were flipping a switch in a secured server room. "Initiate an internal systems audit on all secure net logs for the last 30 minutes, with emphasis on terminal gate activity and any seat remap overrides. Focus on a 10-minute window. Scan internal communications for keywords: priority, override, passenger relocation, behavioral note, class escalation. Then push a remote alert to corporate compliance. Flag emergency protocol, pattern C." There was no audible acknowledgement, but Marcus knew the command had gone through. The back-end systems of Black Nova had been engineered for zero-latency operations, and he still held the keys. Several rows ahead, a male crew member dressed in a gray logistics vest stared at a sudden alert flashing on his tablet. His eyebrows shot upward, and he tapped the screen twice, causing his complexion to drain as he read the name. Marcus Taylor. Below it, a blue-coded alert labeled Black Nova. Override registered. Class 3 authority confirmed. The crew member's hand shook as he turned to a colleague. "Do you know who that is?" he stammered. The woman glanced at the tablet and then back at the crew member, confusion evident on her face. "Passenger 39E, right? The one we moved back near the restroom?" he asked quietly. She shrugged, trying to follow. "No, the CO, he whispered, voice cracking. "He built the system we use to track staff assignments and cargo routing. He's running an audit right now." Both of them froze, the gravity of the situation sinking in faster than the engines outside climbed to cruising altitude. In the tiny jump seat by the lavatory, Marcus Taylor closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear the subtle click of tablet screens and hushed whispers among the crew. He opened his journal, admired its leather cover where every page carried his handwriting, his code, his vision. To him, that notebook was more than a diary. It was a symbol that no one could ever question his integrity or the legitimacy of his presence on this flight. A few rows ahead in the economy section, a young man leaned over his laptop, fingers flying as he reviewed slides for an early morning presentation. His Delta Global Ventures lanyard swung gently as he peered at the screen, which displayed in big blue letters, Strategic Integration Summit, Zurich, 7 a.m. Keynote, Mr. Marcus Taylor, CEO, Black Nova Software. The woman sitting beside him glanced over curiously and then raised her eyebrows. "Is Marcus Taylor on this flight?" she whispered. He chuckled, loud enough for an attendant passing by to overhear. "Yeah, big meeting. He's our keynote speaker." The attendant paused mid-step, clipboard in hand, her eyes flicking toward the cabin curtain. She swallowed hard, the name Marcus Taylor echoing in her mind alongside memories of how they'd treated him earlier. She lifted the clipboard as though searching for a procedure, but her fingers trembled so much that the papers nearly slipped. She tucked the clipboard under her arm and hurried toward the galley, hands pressed against her chest as if to keep her heart in place. Down near the front, in first class, the man in seat 2C, Richard Hastings, vice president of one of Delta's European investment boards, had just raised his glass for a refill when his tablet pinged with an urgent memo from Delta's Zurich division. He frowned, clicked open the message, and froze mid-sip. Delta SecureNet Advisory, Black Nova Executive Arrival Priority Clearance Required, the subject read. The company-issued headshot of Marcus Taylor stared back at him. Below it, a warning in red, Level A clearance subject to NDA, do not delay or share. Richard's hand trembled as he lowered the tablet. The crisp scotch in his glass suddenly smelled like bitter regret. At that exact moment, a junior flight support assistant in the galley was printing out a confidential slide packet sent by corporate HQ. The printer whirred and spat out a sheet that bore the title, Black Nova Executive Arrival Priority Clearance Required. On the second page, highlighted in red, was a headshot of Marcus Taylor with the notation, Keynote Speaker, Corporate Strategy Panel, Restricted Access, Badge Required. The assistant stared at the page in horror and glanced over at her colleague. "Do you know who that is?" she asked, voice shaking. "Passenger 39E, the other woman said with a smug raise of her eyebrow until she saw the printout. Recognition dawned in her eyes and drained the color from her face. "That's the CEO of the system we licensed for logistics. Tomorrow's conference keynote." Whispers exploded among the crew like a faulty engine. A purser in the galley grabbed the assistant by the elbow. "We moved him to the back," she hissed. "We filed that incident report with his name on it?" The assistant nodded, unable to look her in the eye. "He could pull the plug on our API integrations with a single call." The purser's expression crumpled. "We can't let this go unaddressed," she muttered. Marcus Taylor remained motionless in his jump seat, hands folded on his journal. He felt the atmosphere shift around him, a subtle tremor in the cabin's foundation. He had cataloged every slight, every sniff, every clapping echo that had celebrated his humiliation. Now, those echoes were swallowed by a new sound. Panic. The cargo door hissed open as the plane taxied to the gate. The captain strode toward the front door, shoulders squared, but even his usual confidence faltered when he noticed the faces of the gate agents waiting to greet him. The senior gate agent held a tablet with an emergency alert from Black Nova's Zurich office. Security briefing, incident of class bias and internal breach. Audit findings, pending legal review. A timestamp showed the alert was released less than an hour ago. The agent's earpiece blinked red, sweat beading at his hairline. Behind the curtain, the crew exchanged anxious glances. A senior operations lead muttered into his headset, "They cut us off. Black Nova has suspended our back-end sync." In the airline's command center, IT staff stared at blinking warnings, routing errors, API timeouts, live tracking interruptions. On the screens of corporate HQ, located just 5 miles from the terminal, the executive board convened an emergency meeting. A stock price graph revealed a 13% plunge in real time, while social media sentiment hit an all-time low. 87 emails flooded the compliance inbox with legal threats citing breach of ethical protocols and contract reassessment. "We cannot hold this line," one board member said flatly. "This is hemorrhaging." The CEO of Delta sat silent, face ashen, as the word optics was used 37 times in the next 20 minutes. By the meeting's end, he had resigned in disgrace. Meanwhile, on the jet bridge, executives arriving for the Zurich Forum found themselves met not with hospitality but with breaking headlines on their phones. Tech CEO discriminated against by airline partner. Delta faces backlash for mistreating VIP on international route. Black Nova's Marcus Taylor silently triggers internal investigation mid-air. Video clips from the flight, though grainy, were enough to confirm the story. One clip showed Marcus Taylor's calm composure as he was escorted away while other passengers clapped. Hashtags began to trend. Seat for sale. Delta disgrace. Justice for... VC firms issued veiled threats. One European logistics platform announced suspension of all current API integrations with DeltaNet. A prominent diversity-fecund investing group declared, "We will not work with platforms that normalize exclusion." Social media became a courtroom, and Delta was on trial. When Marcus Taylor finally stepped off the plane, he was the last passenger to disembark. No cameras followed, no applause greeted him. The terminal was hushed, its polished floors reflecting the muted footsteps of gate agents who dared not look him in the eye. His carry-on rolled behind him, each turn of the wheels marking a victory in the silence that was now thick with consequence. Yet the quiet was not empty. It was heavy with accountability, with the realization that the first to fall from grace had been Richard Hastings, identified through surveillance photos and social media sleuthing. His LinkedIn profile reflected the humiliation of his own mocking tone. Now, he was the subject of a trending investigation into hate speech policy violations. Back at corporate HQ, the executive who'd resigned left behind his office key card on a glossy mahogany desk. His departure memo cited irreparable damage to brand reputation. The compliance inbox still buzzed with incoming legal notices from 5 major software vendors threatening to sever ties unless Delta immediately addressed systemic bias. In the days that followed, Delta issued formal apologies, sent compensation credits to affected passengers, and announced a sweeping review of its diversity and inclusion protocols. Several mid-level crew members were placed on leave, pending investigation, while the manager, who'd overseen that morning's gate operations, was reassigned. The airline's board voted to partner with an external auditor to review every SecureNet access log, ensuring transparency that would never again be bypassed by Prejudice. Meanwhile, Marcus Taylor's keynote in Zurich was delayed by 12 hours amid widespread media interest. When he finally took the stage, the audience greeted him with a standing ovation that felt less like courtesy and more like a celebration of justice served. In his speech, he spoke not of revenge but of accountability, of the power of data and transparency to root out bias and rebuild trust. His calm voice resonated through the hall. At 25,000 feet, we saw how easily dignity can be stripped away, but data, when wielded responsibly, can restore it. The applause that followed shook the room. For a woman of 65 watching from home, this story was a reminder that injustice can lurk even in the most polished settings. It was also proof that one person's quiet resolve and meticulous preparation can topple an entire house of cards built on prejudice. Marcus Taylor's response was neither explosive nor vindictive. It was methodical, precise, and devastatingly effective. And for everyone who had watched, whether on that flight or from their living rooms, it was profoundly satisfying to see truth and dignity prevail. Richard Halverson, CFO at a mid-size finance firm with government defense contracts, became the most despised man on Flight 247. The moment his smug grin appeared in that 10-second clip, clapping as Marcus Taylor was marched away, social media ignited. His face was overlaid with words like entitled, racist, and walking lawsuit. Screenshots spread faster than a plane traveling at 500 miles per hour. Within hours, 25 complaints swamped his company's general inbox, and the link to their diversity policy crashed under the load. By day 3, his firm released a terse statement. Mr. Halverson's comments and actions on Delta Flight 2427 do not reflect our values. Effective immediately, he is no longer employed. The press release ended with a link to that same diversity policy, which collapsed again under 100, 0 hits in minutes. He tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but leaked emails revealed him framing Marcus's presence as a charity gesture gone wrong. Even his fellow executives wouldn't back him. Contracts unraveled next. One major aviation security software agreement, ironically tied to his own firm's services, was terminated overnight. Clients who'd once praised his leadership began pulling accounts, citing ethics clauses. Richard's professional website now led to a blank 404-page, and his LinkedIn profile vanished. He sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, his phone buzzing with missed calls from former colleagues and endless media requests he couldn't escape. Lauren Reed, the lead attendant whose name badge flashed in too many clips to deny, was the second domino. Passengers who'd witnessed her cold refusal to explain Marcus's reassignment filed formal complaints. A retired judge 2 rows back and a school principal both added their voices. Within days, a petition demanding Delta overhaul its anti-bias training gathered 600,000 signatures. A viral meme dubbed her most hated employee of the month, complete with a Photoshop crown and smoldering airline logo. An internal probe, fast-tracked under media pressure, found her conduct unprofessional and biased. She was fired the next morning. Delta's board convened an emergency meeting 5 miles from the terminal. In their command center, screens showed a 13% stock drop and API errors as Black Nova's secure connections were suspended. Shareholders demanded cultural reform at cruising altitude. Executives used the word optics so often it echoed like a mantra. The CEO resigned under fire, and the airline issued formal apologies, refunded tickets, and quietly offered compensation flights. Still, no one dared approach Marcus Taylor when he disembarked last, his dignity intact. He rolled his carry-on behind him through the hushed terminal, footsteps echoing on polished tile. Reporters and gate agents averted their eyes as headlines flashed across arriving passengers' phones. Tech CEO discriminated against by airline partner. Delta faces backlash. Justice for Marcus Taylor. It was more than viral outrage. It was accountability delivered at 35,000 feet. For a woman of 65 watching at home, this story shows how one man's quiet resolve and meticulous preparation can overturn systemic bias. Marcus didn't break protocols or shout demands. He flipped the switch on their own systems, preserving every log, every snide remark, every condescending gesture. And when the world finally saw the truth, the fallout was swift and satisfying. That final descent into justice wasn't revenge in the explosive sense. It was precision,